Have you ever wandered through a cemetery reading the inscriptions on the headstones? Suppose you came across one with your name on it. How would you react? And what would happen as a result? For 11-year-old Timothy Murphy, he learns the hard way the answer to this very question in Grave Consequences. Even ghosts need glasses every once in a while. Grave Consequences. Tim Murphy knew there was something evil about the cemetery on the very first day he stood in front of it, peering from beyond the rusty iron gates that guarded its entrance. Tim saw a cemetery unlike he'd ever known before. Instead of the neatly arranged tombstones lining the mowed green lawn, this graveyard was a jumble of chipped, weather-stained monuments leaning this way and among patches of yellow grass, dirt, and weeds. The 11-year-old boy and his mother, Jane, had just moved into the apartment across the street for the forbidding cemetery. Their new home was a cramped two-bedroom apartment in an old section of an industrial town near Boston. It was all his mother could afford following her divorce. At least it was convenient. Tim could catch the school bus just 3 blocks away, and she can walk 6 blocks to the factory for where she worked. During the first few days in the new surroundings, Tim strolled through the graveyard, even though his mother had told him to stay away. Although this place gave him the goosebumps, he found it kind of thrilling to feel a little spooked. Other than a few homeless people, he never saw anyone visit the place or tend to the grounds. Judging from the most recent dates on the tombstones, Tim figured there had been a burial there in about 20 years or so. As he wandered around, he read the inscriptions on the headstones and wondered who these people were, what they looked like, and how they died. George Bigelow, beloved husband and father, born February 12th, 1842, died May 7th, 1910. Sweet infant Sarah Kelly Fitzpatrick, who brought joy to the earth. April 15th, 1825. October 10th, 1825. In loving memory of Mary Margaret Evans, 1823, 1905. Timothy Murphy, 1903 to 1917. Tim froze in his tracks and gulped. That's my name. He looked closer to make sure he wasn't imagining things. The stone marker was typical for the cemetery, only smaller, about 2 feet tall, and rounded at the top. Decades of soot had blackened the edges, and harsh weather had eroded some of the lettering. 2 jagged cracks, shaped like lightning bolts, sliced through the T in Timothy and the P in Murphy. But there was no mistaking the name, Tim. The thought of seeing his own name carved in a headstone sent a shiver up his spine. There was nothing else written on the marker to give Tim any clue about the person who had shared his name. He must have come from a poor family to have such a small gravestone. Tim thought. He was only 14 years old. That's just 3 years older than me. I wonder how he died. Was he sick? Did he drown? Maybe he was murdered? The more Tim looked at the marker, the more uneasy he felt. It gave him the willies. In fact, he didn't ever want to see that tombstone again. It was just too weird to have a marker standing there with his name on it. So with a grunt, Tim pushed hard against that stone. It took him a couple of tries, but finally he managed to topple it over, face down. Then he started to run off, looking over his shoulder to see if anybody had witnessed what he had done. By the time he had returned home, he figured he would never have to think about that gravestone and the late Timothy Murphy again. But he was wrong. Dead wrong. That night, while sleeping in his room, Tim was awakened by an eerie sound, the kind of moaning that repeatedly grew louder and then softer. He jerked up in bed and turned his head from side to side, trying to find the source. But the moaning seemed to be anywhere, yet nowhere. Before Tim had time to get more scared than he already was, his bed began to rock and sway, silently as if it was bobbing on an ocean. Clutching the side of his bed, Tim tried to scream for help, but nothing came out of his mouth. He tried again, this time at the top of his lungs. "Mom! Mom! Make it stop! Make it stop!" Jane Murphy rushed into his room and flipped on the light. "What's wrong, Timmy? Did you hear those strange sounds?" the terrified boy asked. "Didn't you see my bed move?" "What are you talking about, honey?" He told her about the awful moaning and how his bed had rocked by itself. She had seen and heard nothing. However, Jane clearly noticed the terror in her son's eyes. "Sweetheart, it was just a nightmare. That's all," she said. "You probably got some creepy thoughts by playing in that cemetery. Promise me you'll stay away from there. Now," she added as she straightened out his blanket, "try to go back to sleep and think about pleasant thoughts. I'll leave your door open and the bathroom light on. Good night, sweetie. I love you." Tim felt foolish that he had cried out for his mother. Maybe she was right. Maybe it was just a bad dream. He didn't sleep well the rest of the night. When he got up the next morning, he thought his conscience had played a trick on him because he had overturned the gravestone. Just to be on the safe side, maybe if I go to the cemetery and put the marker back, I won't have a bad dream again. Tim trudged through the old cemetery gates, trying to convince himself the horror from the previous night was a figment of his own imagination. But he still had a queasing feeling in his stomach. Somehow, this wasn't over yet, he told himself. As he neared the fallen gravestone, Tim stopped dead in his tracks. A boy was standing next to Timothy Murphy's marker. He hadn't been there a second ago. It was as if he appeared out of thin air. And there was something else odd about him. His clothes were from another time. The boy looked about 14 years old, stocky, with red curly hair sticking from the under a tweed cap, the kind you would see in an old movie. He wore black work boots, wool pants, and the cuffs rolled up, and a dirty white shirt that was torn and tattered, and bloody. But even worse, his right arm was missing, and his shoulder was soaked in blood. The boy squinted his eyes, grimaced in pain, and let out a spine-stinging moan, the same sound Tim had heard from the nights before. Seized with fear, Tim spun on his heels and ran through the monuments, past the cemetery gates, and across the street, into the apartment building, and up the 2 flights of stairs to the floor before he dared to turn around. He fumbled into his pocket for the key and had trouble unlocking the door to his apartment because his hands were trembling so much. Finally, he whipped inside and slammed and bolted the door. With his heart pounding, Tim waited for someone or something to come. Several minutes went by before he timidly walked to the window and peeked outside at the cemetery. No one was there. Then he checked each room in the house. Nothing. Tim breathed a sigh of relief. Thankful his mom was at work so he didn't have to explain what had happened. But what did happen? Was it a prank? Was it my imagination? Or did I see a ghost? Could that have been a ghost of Timothy Murphy, who died? Tim didn't have the answers, but he knew one thing. He never, ever was going back to that cemetery. That night, Tim didn't want to go to bed because he was still afraid. He wanted to stay up as late as he could because it wasn't a school night and his mother was tired from working all day. She let Tim watch television while she went to sleep. About 1 a.m., Tim stumbled into bed, making sure his door was open, the bathroom was light on, and then he drifted off to sleep. Just before dawn, Tim was jarred again by the same dreadful moaning. He threw the covers over his head, but the moaning only intensified. And then Tim's flesh started to crawl when he felt the bed move again. Slowly at first, the rocking back and forth, until it burst into a violent shaking fit as Tim held onto his bed for dear life. The covers flew off. He then saw horrified him. Hovering at the end of his bed was the moaning, one-armed boy. He was staring at Tim with such fury that Tim was sure the boy was going to kill him. Before Tim could utter a sound, the lurching bed pitched onto the floor. Just then his mother burst into the room. "Timmy!" she screamed. "What's happening?" "It's a ghost!" Tim cried. "Look out!" She quickly scanned the room, but saw nothing at first. The ghost had vanished. The bed had stopped shaking, but now she too could hear the awful moaning. Next came the shock of their lives. The chair to Tim's desk zipped across the room by itself and crashed into the door. The bed began to vibrate again and bang repeatedly into the wall. The huge poster of a basketball store taped to the wall was suddenly torn in half by invisible hands. Tim's school books flew through the air like crazed birds knocking his bedside lamp. The the books in his closet were ripped from their hangers. Next, Tim's radio shattered as if an unseen iron fist had pounded on it. And through it all, Tim and Jane Murphy heard the moaning rising and falling in eerie waves. Then, unexpectedly, as it began, the terrifying ordeal ended. Tim and his mother found themselves on their knees, clutching each other. They were too frightened and shocked to utter a sound for several minutes. "This can't be happening," Jane finally said. "I can't believe what I just saw." The stunned mother and her son staggered into the living room and collapsed onto the couch. They tried to make sense of what they just experienced, but they couldn't. "Maybe we should call the police," said Jane. "Mom, no one's going to believe us. They'll think we're nuts." Just then, the moaning started again, and from inside the walls, the loud pounding sound assaulted their ears. "Mom, I'm so scared. Let's get out of here. Now!" Jane grabbed her petrified son by the hand and ran across the hall. She banged on the door of their neighbors, Jack and Lynn Grayson. The sleepy-eyed couple opened the door and were shocked by the terror-stricken faces of the Murphys. "What's all the commotion?" Jack asked. "Who's doing all that banging?" When Jane told him about the violent force that invaded their home, Jack, a hulking stillwalker, marched into their apartment. 2 minutes later, he returned with his eyes wide and his voice trembling. "Something is bad in there. Real bad. The walls and the floors were vibrating like an earthquake, and the chair in the kitchen flipped right over on its back before my very eyes. Your place is haunted." "Stay with us for now," Lynn told the Murphys. "I'll have a friend who knows a psychic investigator. I'll call in the morning. Let's see if he can figure out what to do." But Tim already knew what to do. He knew what had caused the moaning. The shaking bed, the destruction of his room, the banging walls. It was the ghost of Timothy Murphy. It took all the morning for Tim to muster up the courage to go back to the cemetery. When he reached to the graveyard gates, his feet felt like lead, and his stomach was twisted into knots. But when he made himself march past the rows of stark monuments, he was hoping the one-armed ghost wasn't hiding behind one of them. When he was about half a football field away from Timothy Murphy's tombstone, he stopped. He had never had such fear in his life. He was desperately fighting the urge to turn around and run home, but he knew he couldn't. "I've got to do this, or that ghost will haunt us forever, or kill us," Tim told himself. He took a deep breath, then dashed straight for the headstone. His eyes darted back and forth as he ran to the marker, because he didn't want to be surprised if the one-armed boy suddenly appeared. Without wasting a second, Tim lifted the tombstone and put it back as he had found it, securing it with rocks and dirt. Then he stepped back and said out loud, "Look, I'm really sorry. I tipped over your gravestone. I didn't mean to cause any trouble. It's just that you and I have the same name, and I didn't want to have my name on a tombstone. That's all. I felt bad that you died. What happened? Did your arm get chopped off in an accident or something? Anyway, you don't have to haunt my mom or me anymore. I put your tombstone back, okay? Now please, please, leave us alone." Tim waited as long as he dared for some sign of the ghost, but there wasn't any. He sighed with relief and fled that cemetery. That night, while Tim and his mother stayed with his relatives, a psychic investigator camped out in their apartment and found no further evidence of any ghost. But Tim already knew that the ghost of Timothy Murphy, whoever he was finally at rest again. Haunted Kids: True Ghost Stories is the first book in the Haunted Kids series by Allan Zullo, a Scholastic publication. Allan Zullo has authored and co-authored over 120 non-fiction books before he retired in 2022. So join me again soon for some more spooky true stories. And don't forget to visit my Patreon and join my Scream team for some spooktacular books. So this is your ghostly hostess, Lady Blanche. Good fright.